There are places that fade with time and places that remain. Not because they were meant to endure, but because what happened within them was too large to forget. In the rolling hills of eastern Pennsylvania, just beyond the Schuylkill River, there is a place where the ground itself seems to remember. Here, buildings rise from the landscape like remnants of another era. Long corridors stretching into emptiness, and windows reflecting only sky and weather. What remains is not a single structure, but an arrangement of purpose, a system, a place once designed to operate independently of everything around it. Today, the sounds are gone. No footsteps in the corridors, no voices in the halls or units, and no machinery humming in the basements. Only silence, settled into brick and concrete like something absorbed over time. But this was not always a place of absence and abandonment, at least not in any conscientiously understood way. For nearly 80 years, this campus was home to thousands of lives, known simply as the Children. Others came to build and maintain it, to care for the patients, and believe in what this place was supposed to represent. At its height, it functioned not as a hospital alone, but as a self-contained city, complete with its own infrastructure, its own rhythms, and its own rules. It was built with a belief that society could be engineered, that difference could be organized, and that care, if properly structured, could be made efficient. And for a time, that belief held. But beliefs do not remain fixed. They expand, they adapt, they strain, until eventually, they reveal what they were always becoming. This place did not emerge from cruelty, it emerged from certainty. Certainty that human difference could be classified, that isolation could be therapeutic, and that the state could manage what families could not. Confinement, not as punishment, but as necessity. This is the story of Pennhurst State School and Hospital.
These are some of the sights and sounds of Pennhurst, the state institution for the mentally retarded. It's located in Spring City, Chester County. In 1908, when the institution first opened, the man in charge bitterly complained to the state that the conditions were already overcrowded. He transferred many of the patients to Q1, a classroom building. Many of them are still there.
At the turn of the 20th century, institutions like Pennhurst were not considered controversial, they were considered modern. Across the United States, reformers, physicians, and lawmakers increasingly believed that society could be improved through organized systems of care and supervision. Industrialization had transformed American life, and cities expanded faster than infrastructure could support them. Immigration reshaped urban neighborhoods, and public agencies struggled to respond to poverty, illness, disability, and social dependency on a scale the 19th century had never encountered. The response was institutional. Governments constructed hospitals, reformatories, poorhouses, sanitariums, and asylums, designed not only to house populations, but to manage them. Within this climate, disability became increasingly medicalized. Conditions once understood through family, community, or religious life were now categorized through diagnosis, classification, and state oversight. The emerging field of eugenics reinforced these beliefs. Its advocates argued that intellectual disability, epilepsy, mental illness, and other forms of human difference threatened both social order and national progress. Segregation was presented not as punishment, but as protection, and many believed protection for the individual as well. In 1903, Pennsylvania authorized the construction of the Eastern State Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic. The facility was designed in the Jacobean Revival style by architect Philip H. Johnson and opened in November 1908 on more than 600 acres of farmland in Chester County. Dormitories such as buildings U and V, later known as Union and Vincennes Halls, along with others, were designed to house 500 residents, though eventually thousands would pass through its doors. By the 1920s, Pennhurst had grown far beyond its original design. What began as a specialized institution gradually evolved into something far larger, a closed and expanding world unto itself. New buildings rose across the campus as patient populations increased. A new administration building was built in 1918, and the following year, 2 new dormitories, buildings M and L, later known as Mayflower and Limerick Halls, were built. A dedicated medical facility arrived in 1921. Pennhurst did not function as a single building. It functioned as a system that, at its height, the campus operated much like a self-contained municipality. The institution maintained its own power plant, laundry facilities, kitchens, workshops, and agricultural operations. Beneath the grounds, tunnels carried steam pipes and electrical lines, allowing staff to move through the campus unseen beneath the surface. Everything required coordination, and everything was dependent upon routine. Residents woke according to schedule. Meals were served in shifts. Bathing rotated through limited facilities. Medical distribution, work assignments, cleaning details, inspections, and bed checks structured the day from morning until night. The institution relied heavily upon patient labor to sustain itself. Those considered capable of work were assigned throughout the campus. Some washed laundry, others worked in kitchens, boiler rooms, the farm, or on maintenance crews. Many performed the repetitive labor necessary to keep the institution operational. Administrators frequently described this work as therapeutic. Vocational training intended to build discipline, responsibility, and routine. But the labor also reduced operational costs. As patient populations increased, staffing often failed to keep pace. Annual reports repeatedly documented overcrowding and budget shortages. Dormitories designed for dozens house far more. Rows of beds filled open units with little separation between residents, and as a result, privacy became increasingly rare. During certain periods, a single attendant might supervise dozens of individuals at once. The strain affected every part of the institution. Between 1930 and 1945, no less than 6 entire new buildings were designed by architect George Levat Sr. State appropriations, though, rarely kept pace with census growth or facility deterioration.
I also spoke with the business manager here at Pennhurst, Elmer McSurdy. I questioned him on the cost of repairing the buildings.
Can't touch a building unless you're ready to spend $1 million or $1.5 million. Now, as long as the buildings stand the way they are, the law doesn't require that they come in and close it down.
Some of them should be closed down, shouldn't they?
I presume if labor and industry were to inspect them as they stand now with the idea in mind that they must meet their requirements, they would be closed.
And yet, expansion continued. Because Pennhurst reflected a broader belief shared by many public officials of the era, that large institutions represented efficiency, that centralized care could solve problems too complex for families or local communities to manage alone. Inside the institution, however, the realities of daily life grew increasingly difficult to contain. For many residents, Pennhurst was no longer temporary placement, it became permanence. Children admitted in the early decades often aged into adulthood within the same system, and some remained for most, if not all, of their lives. The outside world continued forward beyond the campus boundaries, but inside, time moved differently. Life inside Pennhurst was defined by proximity. Dozens of residents slept within the same rooms with beds arranged in long rows beneath fluorescent lights. Personal belongings were limited. Clothing circulated communally through institutional laundries. Privacy existed rarely, and often not at all. The scale of the institution shaped nearly every aspect of daily existence. Meals were prepared for thousands and served according to schedule. Bathing rotated through overcrowded facilities, and movement between buildings occurred in groups under staff supervision. Individual routine gradually gave way to institutional routine. For many residents, daily life unfolded within the same limited sequence of spaces. Some attended classes, while others participated in basic vocational programs or recreational activities organized by the staff. Holiday celebrations occasionally appeared inside assembly halls and day rooms with decorations and music, but beneath those moments, the overcrowding remained constant. As patient populations increased throughout the mid-20th century, meaningful individual attention became increasingly difficult to sustain. Staff shortages affected nearly every department, and attendants were expected to supervise large numbers of residents simultaneously, often with limited training and little institutional support. Under those conditions, care became procedural. Residents who displayed repetitive movements, withdrawal, or self-stimulating behavior were frequently understood through diagnosis. The environment itself was rarely considered as a contributing factor, and later developmental research would suggest otherwise. Psychologists and disability advocates increasingly concluded that prolonged institutionalization could intensify emotional distress, impair social development, and reinforce dependency. Behaviors once interpreted solely as symptoms of disability were understood as responses to isolation, overstimulation, and lack of meaningful personal autonomy. Inside Pennhurst, however, such ideas emerged slowly. For many families, commitment had been presented as both medical guidance and social necessity. After a mandatory separation of 2 months, some families visited frequently, while others were encouraged to limit contact so residents could better adjust to institutional life. Over time, however, that separation became routine. Letters preserved in archives reveal fragments of lives continuing behind these walls. These were small reminders that beyond the diagnosis and census reports, that individuals were attempting to preserve connection to a world increasingly distant from them. Pennhurst did not create disability, but institutional life often magnified its consequences. And as the decades passed, the distance between the institution's stated purpose and its daily reality grew more difficult to ignore. For decades, Pennhurst existed behind its walls with little public scrutiny. The institution had become part of Pennsylvania's landscape, known by name but rarely understood by those outside it. By the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, the cracks were no longer hidden. What had once been presented as a progressive solution to care for the disabled had become overwhelmed by its own scale. Patient population continued to rise while staffing and resources struggled to keep pace. Dormitories designed for dozens now held hundreds, and conditions deteriorated. As the institution expanded, so too did the emotional distance between the people inside and the world beyond the gates. For many residents, Pennhurst was no longer temporary care. It had become a permanent confinement. Families who visited often encountered a different reality. Patients sitting silently in overcrowded units. Limited personal attention. Entire lives reduced to routine and management. Inside the institution, many staff tried to provide compassion under increasingly impossible conditions, but the system itself had begun to fail. By the late 1960s, criticism could no longer be contained behind Pennhurst's walls. In 1968, Philadelphia television reporter Bill Baldini entered Pennhurst with cameras from WCAU-TV and produced a groundbreaking investigative series titled Suffer the Little Children. What viewers saw shocked them. With cameras rolling, he entered Pennhurst and documented what had long been confined behind its walls. Overcrowded day rooms, neglected residents, conditions that spoke less of care and more of abandonment. One comparison made on the air cut through public perception with particular force. Some zoos in the United States, it was revealed, were spending more per day caring for animals than Pennsylvania was spending on the children at Pennhurst. For viewers across the region, this was no longer an abstraction. It was visible, immediate, and undeniable. For many, it was the first time they had truly seen life inside Pennhurst. The reports ignited outrage, and they also forced a larger national conversation. Across the United States, attitudes towards institutionalization were beginning to change. Medical professionals, disability advocates, and families increasingly questioned whether massive state institutions could ever provide humane care. The belief that people with disabilities should be isolated from society was slowly beginning to erode. In the years that followed, Pennhurst became the center of one of the most significant disability rights cases in American history. In 1974, a federal lawsuit was filed on behalf of Pennhurst residents, known as Halderman versus Pennhurst. This case argued that the institution violated patients' constitutional rights through unsafe conditions and inadequate care. The legal battle that followed would last for years. The case helped reshape disability rights law across the United States, and gradually, the institution that once symbolized modern care became a symbol of systemic failure. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Pennhurst population steadily declined. Residents were transferred to smaller community homes, care facilities, and supervised programs throughout Pennsylvania. Buildings that once housed thousands slowly emptied. Windows darkened, and corridors fell silent. The routines that had governed daily life for nearly 8 decades began to disappear. Then, in December 1987, Pennhurst officially closed. For some, the closure represented long overdue justice. For others, especially former employees and some families, the ending was more complicated. Because Pennhurst was never defined by one single story, it was shaped by contradictions, by people who tried to help within a broken system, by policies rooted in fear, misunderstanding, and separation, and by residents whose voices were too often ignored. Even after the doors closed, the memory of Pennhurst remains, not simply as an abandoned institution, but as a reminder of how society once chose to treat those it considered different. A reminder of what happens when care becomes custody, when overcrowding replaces humanity, and when people disappear behind walls built in the name of protection.